LE being that are taking into the account our collective responsibility, equity, and collectivity needed to the balance of the sustainability of life and health of the planet. I also look forward to hearing the formation of the International Network African Studies at the continental level and discussing the meaning and the role of the African studies in Africa with everyone involved in African studies here. So, Professor Kafa, please begin your presentation. Please. I'll give you. Yes, it's okay.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you. I understand.
Okay. Yeah.
So good evening, and very much welcome to this presentation. I'm really, really honored to have you here. I was having a little chat with a colleague before the presentation, just about my shirt. And I told the person who is in the room and who can recognize herself that I decided to put on my best shirt from Africa, simply because I'm coming to talk about Africa, but also because the person who gave this gift to me and who was like a mentor, a dear friend, a father figure to me, Professor Magesa, Laurenti Magesa from Tanzania, has ever since passed away. He died in August of 2022. And for me to be standing here and wearing this is in a way as an African to honor his memory and to recognize that, you know, he is here with us. That's how Africans think. So death is not the end of life. Death is the beginning of a new relationship with those who left and went before us. So coming back to I want first of all to say a big thank you to the association, organization, Sophia University, professors, my student here, for giving me this opportunity to be introducing to you some of the research that we have been doing on the African continent. As you can see, the title of my topic, which seems to be fancy, but it means nothing. Okay, African Studies in Africa, a generational and epistemological insurrection. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about really, you know, the history of all the research that we do on the African continent, the Association of African Studies on the African continent, the raison d'etre, like why do we have to have this, you know, organization, and some of the history behind it, and of course, what are the implications about, you know, the association. So let me see if the technology works. Do I need to do something different? Okay, it works. Good. Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you. So basically, as I was saying, the title of my presentation this afternoon, we'll be looking at the generational and epistemological insurrection. What is that supposed to mean anyway? So that's what I'll be explaining, okay? But I am looking very much at the younger generation of African scholars. Those have been blessed to be working with, okay, across the African continent as president of the African Studies Association of Africa, about their research, about their questions, about their preoccupations, and about the output, okay, the knowledge production that they've been making, and the kind of, let's say, distance, okay, or innovation, if you will, that they try to bring to doing research about Africa, to producing knowledge about Africa. So it is generation, it is epistemology or knowledge, or the sense of knowledge, okay? My main argument is that this generation of African scholars has come of age, okay? And it is taking really seriously the challenge of producing knowledge that is related to Africa, so developing knowledge. And let me be honest, I didn't know what my audience this evening would look like. So it looks like I may need to unpack some of the concepts that I'll be using just for the sake of you getting to understand where we're coming from, okay? So the development of knowledge on the African continent is really not only an academic exercise, it is very much a political, okay, endeavor. So a political engagement. And I will talk about that a little bit later, okay? So this younger generation is somehow, and this is what I'm saying, unapologetically, okay, Africa-centered in their approach. And that is where the whole debate about producing knowledge about Africa comes from. What is Africa anyway? Who has the right to speak about Africa? What kind of Africa are they talking about? Okay, so I'll be developing some of these issues and ideas. So my confidence, you know, in just mentioning the kind of argument I am making comes very much from, let's say, three major sources, okay? There is a book that has just been published recently. It's like a week, 2 weeks old. I had the chance to collaborate with the scholars who were working on it. They're scattered across not only Africa, but the globe, okay? They're based in different universities in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in Africa, all over. And the book, which I'll mention, is Africa Beyond the Inventions, okay? There is another book that came out last year, published at the University of KwaZulu-Natal Press in South Africa. And this book is talking very much about epistemologies from the global South. And what I like about these two books is that while we are talking about decolonizing knowledge or knowledges on the African continent, these scholars are not going back all the way to the colonial days. They are taking issues with the early generation of Africans, scholars like writers, researchers, and try to engage them. So there is that shift, which is very subtle. I would say that the early generation of Africans who were engaged in scholarship, they were very much responding to what was written about Africa by the colonial powers. Okay, so that we will be talking about the colonial library, or the amount of production of knowledge that was left behind, okay, by, let's say, the colonial researchers, anthropologists, sociologists, you name it. And so all of this amount of knowledge constitute what we look at, what Mudimbe actually has called the colonial library. And this colonial library is very subtle, because most of the things that people still know about Africa to this day is still very much informed by that colonial library. So I had a very good conversation before this conference, and I was saying I was really, really impressed by the amount of work and engagement that Japanese scholars do have with Africa, but we in Africa don't have access to this knowledge. And why I like this knowledge coming from Japan, it's because Japan and Africa have a completely different history than the history that Africa had with Europe, France, England, Belgium, Holland, the US, and so on and so forth. So the Western relationship to Africa is very much colonial and neo-colonial. That is why when we discuss scholarship, we tend to look at the decolonization of the mind, okay, meaning quitting that mindset which the colonial library has been able to form or format or leave behind, okay? So the third source of my confidence is coming from Professor Toda. When she introduced me, she said that I am working on the editorial board of one journal. This is a journal that we started in Africa only 2 years ago. It is called Global Africa Journal. It is a journal that is very ambitious. It wants to be a scholarly journal, peer-reviewed journal, where Africans can have a place to publish their research. It is a journal that is multidisciplinary. It is a journal that is multilingual. Okay, so we want to be publishing in several languages in this journal. And every time we receive articles, we try at least to translate them into 4 languages: Arabic, French, English, and Swahili. And in our plan, in our project, we hope actually that we can even extend it to other African languages, including Wolof, or some other African languages. So scholars who have been publishing in this journal are also ambitious to say, let us be producing knowledge, developing knowledge that is not addressing the colonial master of yesterday, but knowledge that is geared toward nurturing the minds of our own folks, our own people on the African continent. Okay. So this evening, my presentation will be just 3 major parts. Okay. The first part, I want to talk a little bit about the African Studies Association of Africa. Where are we coming from? How did it develop? Who are we anyway? What are we doing? What are the we're trying to make? Okay, so that will be the first part. It's really to look at the timeline and the history of African Studies Association of Africa. The second part of my talk will be now to do some kind of analysis of what I'm calling, the epistemological insurrection, okay, the break into older production of knowledge, very much methodologies, looking at the West as the center of the world, to the new ways of looking at Africa, its realities, and for whom we are producing knowledge on the African continent. And the third part will be to look at what are the implications, anyway, of these knowledges that we are producing for Africa on the African continent. And then after this, it is my hope that we can have a very lively and good conversation. So I try to keep it short. There is so much we can say about this, but I will try to see how I can be short so that we have a chance to interact with the audience. Okay. So let us begin. First things first. Really, I think in a nutshell, I have a couple of questions that I hope my presentation this evening or this afternoon will be addressing. First is to see address the question what. Okay, the what question of African studies, and what is African studies? We talk about African studies. What is African studies anyway? I can tell you that I have my senior scholars here. I'm an African, by the way, just in case you forget. I'm an African, and in Africa we value senior people, the elders. And so when I'm speaking, even in front of my elders, my seniors, I know I have to keep it to my place. But anyways, what I'm trying to say is that sharing the question about what is Africa is something that has not found or made any consensus in the academic community. Okay. Anyone has the right to speak about Africa, whether in the US, in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, everybody has the right. But when African scholars stand up to say, no, we don't recognize the kind of Africa you're talking about, that's not our Africa, okay? So you begin to understand that there is a problem. And so we can look at that question, which philosophers would call the question of ontology, the subject matter of what we're discussing, okay? The second question would be rather the how question, okay? So how do we get to the knowledge that we have produced about Africa? How? What are the methodologies that we have applied? What are the underneath, like the underlying hidden agendas or the interest in producing this knowledge? Because there is no such thing like objective and pure knowledge, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Let us be clear about that. Knowledge is always political, okay? It is for someone and for some purpose, okay? And so the much knowledge that was produced about Africa until the 60s, basically, it was colonial knowledge, and it was produced by amazing people whom when you read today, you kind of question yourself, you say, but How could such a brilliant scholar say things like this? Okay. I've developed this as a paper that can be published later on. I'm not using my paper. I'm not using all the stuff. But as I'm saying this about the scholarship produced, I'm thinking about Hegel. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the philosopher Hegel, who was a German philosopher, 19th century, basically. And Hegel's knowledge is still very much used to this day. But Hegel is one of those scholars who inscribed Africa in the history of no history, if you will. So Hegel said simply that when we're talking about Africa, maybe we should look at Northern Africa. But Sub-Saharan Africa, there is nothing you can learn from there. These are people who have never entered history. Therefore, let us just pass, and there is no interest looking that way, okay? And later on, when political scientists came to subdivide the regions for studies, we know that usually you will lump together the North African region with the Middle East and not with Africa. So that is a political statement already. And I keep telling people it makes no sense. Morocco is in Africa. Algeria is in Africa. Tunisia is in Africa. Libya is in Africa. For God's sake, it is not part of the Middle East. I don't know how many continents we have, but at least I know that when we are hosting or organizing all these soccer, tournaments, African continent, Morocco doesn't play in the league in Europe. They play in Africa. But when it comes to politics and scholarship, okay, we teach, Morocco with the Middle East, and we teach, Senegal with South Africa and the rest of Africa. There is something behind that, a political statement, which we need to be aware of. And this could come also from called Hegel, who believed that Sub-Saharan Africa has no interest whatsoever. Let's leave it aside, okay? I write in my paper also that I think it was in 2007, the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, he goes to Senegal, Dakar, and he's having a conversation with the parliaments, like MPs, in Dakar, in Senegal. And you won't believe it, 2007. And Nicolas Sarkozy has the guts to tell the MPs in Senegal that Africa has not entered history yet. Gosh. Who are you, Nicolas Sarkozy, to tell me that I don't have a history? But just to tell you that it is coming from very far, someone like Hegel. In 2017, the G7 is meeting in Germany, in Hamburg. President Emmanuel Macron is giving like a press conference on the side of the conference and talking about African issues. And Macron tells the journalists that, the problem of Africa, this is a civilizational problem. African people know you can't bring development to them because guess what? They have wide, large families of 7, 8, 9, 10 kids. How can you develop such a place? Oh my God. Macron needs someone to address him, to respond to him, okay? And Africans, the scholarship that I'm talking about is that you have a younger generation of scholars who are unapologetical about defending their image, the image of Africa, and defending the rights and the interests of Africa. And so they have been addressing some of these rhetorics and discourses, okay? Yes, I think I've said this already, so I can move on. Let me begin with the first part of my talk, the African Studies Association of Africa. What is this anyway? I came, I think, with a copy of our program from last year, maybe. Okay, very good. It can go around. Yeah, just wanted to mention that. But last year, the African Studies Association of Africa met in Lubumbashi. the Democratic Republic of Congo, to celebrate its 10th anniversary, but it was actually our 5th biennial conference. So every year, every 2 years, sorry, the African Studies Association of Africa meets and brings scholars from all over the world to discuss matters pertaining to Africa. We are young, we are very young as an association. 10 years is not that much, but 10 years is something that really we needed to come together and pat ourselves on the back to say we've been able to make it. Because this is some conversation that has been ongoing for more than 50, 60 years. To say we need a platform, we need a space where Africans can be meeting and talking about things that are of their interest. Okay? About scholarship, about academia, okay? So Lubumbashi was a great moment. Lubumbashi was a challenge, first of all. The DRC is one of those places that when you go online on the website of maybe the Japanese embassy, they will tell you, please be careful about traveling to. Yeah, I had a wonderful meeting with the Japanese ambassador to the Congo this afternoon, by the way, and I forgot to tell him that he needs to change that statement because Congo has maybe 100 million people who are living on a daily basis. You have pockets of places that no one would venture, even myself. As a Congolese, I wouldn't go there because I know there is war. But when you look at the map of the conflicts happening in the Congo, you realize that these conflicts are taking place only around mining sites. So the war and the conflict in the Congo is highly correlated to the mineral, rush, if you will. Okay, but you have people who are living in Kinshasa, in Lubumbashi, in Bukavu, in Goma, in major cities, Congo, on a daily basis, and who also tend to forget that there is war going on. Okay, so depending on what kind of message you send out there, people can begin to look down on this country. And for us, ASAA, saying we are going to hold our 5th biennial conference in Congo in Lubumbashi. I just remember the debates, okay? The discernment that led us to this decision. And people said, this is why ASAA exists in the first place. It's because you need to challenge the dominant rhetoric about African countries. It's because we want to be in charge and control what is being said. It is because we also want people who really love Africa to show they love Africa. And that those who will be coming to attend this conference, it means they're not coming just for the kind of intellectual tourism, okay? Because you do have that as well, but they have at heart, the kind of production of knowledge that we want to have. So we met in Lubumbashi. We didn't have as big a crowd as we usually had, or that we would have expected, but at least we have more than 250 scholars coming from Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the US, of course, has always the biggest delegation, Europe, okay, I mentioned that already, and across the African continent as well, but also Latin America and Canada. So to just be able to bring 250 people together in those situations or circumstances, for us, it was something to celebrate, okay? So what am I saying here? Sorry. My thing is working when it wants. Okay, thank you. Okay, very good. So is it battery, you think? Okay, I can use that. That's fine. Sure, no problem. Yeah. So I was talking about Lubumbashi and why we had to go to Lubumbashi, making a statement, challenging the dominant rhetoric and telling the rest of the world that Congo is not that of a hell. There is life. And everyone who made the trip to Lubumbashi went back extremely elated, satisfied, because guess what? During the conference, we took a day, like, some kind of tourism, and we went to the site where Emery Patrice Lumumba was assassinated. Maybe some of you may be too young to know who Lumumba is, but in the universe of scholarship, Pan-Africanism, politics, decolonization, and post-colonial studies, Lumumba is a powerful figure who stood up against the Western interest, and he didn't last, of course, because he got killed, and we know where he was killed. Okay. So we went there, and for most of our delegates, it was like a pilgrimage, a spiritual trip to a site where people felt really, so I have some images of this, which I will be showing you. The topic of our biennial last year was to look also at an issue that is really, really being discussed by African scholars nowadays, which is repatriating Africa. So just to say we want to repatriate Africa, people would ask you from where and what kind of Africa. But you have the Africa that is very much buried in archives, in international libraries, in museums, okay, that Africans are saying, until we get this Africa back on the continent and are able to control the image, we will continue to be subservient to the West. It's good, thank you. Wonderful, thank you. So that's Lubumbashi, and that's Mjiba, who is one of the officials of the African Studies Association of Africa. She's our treasurer, and she teaches at the University of Ghana, okay, Legon campus. Mjiba is African-American, but Ethiopian African-American, I would say, okay? So this is in Lubumbashi. And here I want simply to say that the African Studies Association of Africa, even when we claim to have 10 years only, now 11, actually we have a long, long history. And our history goes as far back as the early 1960s. Okay, already African scholars were discussing about having that space where they can come and feel free to set the agenda. Setting the agenda is very important, okay? And where they would come and say, this place, we are the masters, okay? And I will talk more about the African Studies Association membership, but I remember some of our graduate students who are doing their PhDs, maybe in American universities, one sharing with me one time that, oh my God, I feel so free to be here, because at least I can speak my mind. I do not have to control what I'm saying and how I'm behaving myself without being judged, because the gaze of the other person can be constraining and can define even the kind of relationship that you maintain with yourself. And so having that space for us was very, very important, okay? But going back to the history of the foundation of ASAA, in 1962, most of the African countries were only becoming independent. And so we knew that there is no way you can talk about colonization, independence, without talking about knowledge production. Okay, those who have studied Marxism will tell you that you have the structure and the superstructure. So the ideologies, the knowledges, the beliefs that sustain everything. And I told you that my meeting this afternoon with the Japanese ambassador to the DRC, I was with a fellow Jesuit brother, and this Jesuit was saying, oh my God, I can't believe the Japanese resilience, I mean the spirit, because when you look at Japan, you know that everything that is flourishing is just like flowers on a tree. And so I want to get really back to that tree that is able to produce the fruit that we are seeing, meaning what is the grounding, the foundation, the beliefs, the spirit, actually, that is behind all the development that we can see. And Africans knew that to get back to that tree, to that spirit, we needed to produce knowledge, to revisit, first of all, the knowledge that was left by the colonials, and to produce knowledge that will be correcting, okay, all the biases that were produced before. So ASAA was launched in 2013. It was the product of several discussions. I was not even there yet. I was not a member yet, but many of my senior, scholars on the African continent were meeting either at the University of Cape Town, University of Legon, Ghana, and they came from all over. Kenyatta University in Nairobi, Nairobi University, Makerere University in Kampala, University of Dar es Salaam, and they were saying, we have some unfinished business. We need to make this a reality, a space, a platform where we can come without necessarily being obliged to go to the US or to England when we need to talk about ourselves and our issues, okay? And so they met several times until 2013, which was the year, how do I call, the African Studies, no, sorry, the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana was celebrating its 50th anniversary. That is why I'm saying that ASAA has actually a link with the creation, the beginning, the inauguration of the Institute of Studies on the continent, okay, 1963. 1963 was also the time that the Organization of African Unity started by African president. And so I will tell you that next to our biennial conference, we had another structure which we call ICAD, International Congress of African and African Diaspora Studies, that met in the margin of our biennial conference to celebrate and commemorate the 60th anniversary of the AU, the African Union. Okay, so these are scholars who belong to the African Studies Association US, the ASWAD, which is an African American, body of African studies. Africa is a country, and ourselves. And just to tell you, a quick story on the side. Every time that these organizations come together, rapport or relationships are not always smooth because we do not agree on all things. Okay, I told you that there is really conflict between scholars to just define what is African studies. Okay, so when I say we had this meeting with, the ICAD meeting, we had to agree, where do we host this meeting? Do we go to Ghana, where it all started? Do we go to Congo, where we are hosting this conference in order not to duplicate and multiply things? Do we go to the US, because the US was holding also in December in San Francisco its own annual conference? So where do we go? And we had to come together as leaders of these associations and try to discuss. And I remember reminding my colleagues that, look here, we're celebrating something that is strongly related to Africa. So I think for the first time, at least, you need to keep quiet and listen to what Africans want. So eventually we agreed on a multi-sited conference. So we had one day in Accra, one day in Lubumbashi, and one day in San Francisco. Okay, just to show you there is power control also behind this. And who funds also, who pays the pipe chooses the tune. That's how you say, right? So who funds this organization can have also a say. So the Ford Foundation has given some funding to celebrate this event. But Ford had earmarked the money and said none of this money should be spent on the Congo, because maybe some reporting, because maybe some corruption that took place before. But again, this is a colonial or neo-colonial way of looking at things, where you don't listen to the people on the ground and you make big decisions from the top, which is something that we really wanted to fight back against. Just to tell you that knowledge production has a lot of politics behind it, okay? So I wanted to make this quotation from my colleague, senior sister, mentor, I would say, Professor Adomako Akosia, well-known, really tremendous thinker on the African continent. And Professor Adomako was the immediate president of ASAA before my tenure. And this is what she said, because she was a member, like a founding member of the ASAA. She says history was made on October 26, 2013, when scholars from different parts of the African continent and beyond met at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, Legon, to establish the African Studies Association of Africa. Okay. This was an important act of solidarity, given that prior efforts to bring us into a formal community had not been sustained, and all the existing African Studies associations were located outside of the continent of Africa. Some groundwork had been laid by African scholars who questioned the political economy of knowledge production and challenged the hegemonic power politics of the African studies in the global north. So you understand where we're coming from. You understand the many challenges that we faced. You understand that when you see something emerge, like the African studies, like any other thing, behind there is a ton and a big amount of effort that has been put in. So the mission that we have as African Studies Association is really to promote Africa's own specific contribution to the advancement of knowledge about the peoples and the cultures of Africa and the diaspora. We have goals, we have, and all of this you can find also on the website of the African Studies Association. Basically, these goals are not reinventing themselves, like, they stand in continuity with that early congress that took place in the early 60s. It is to promote and support the networking and interdisciplinary exchanges among Africanist scholars, centers, and Institute of African Studies on the continent. Currently, some interns in the associations, ASAA, are doing some digging research to find out which school, which university, which country has really a center for African studies on the continent, so that we can list and take stock of all the resources that we do have on the continent. Okay, so I have a list, but it is not updated. So to promote research and discussions on topical issues of concern to the well-being of the Africans. In my conclusion, actually, as I'm talking about the policy making, some issues will be global health. We recently had COVID-19. How was the COVID-19 managed on the African continent? That's a big question. We had some impressive people in France, medical doctors, researchers, who believe that in this day and age, they can stand in front of cameras and say that because we're developing, vaccines, we should go and try them on the African people as guinea pigs. Come on, seriously? So this provoked a huge, in French we say tollé, like confrontation. They had to come out and apologize. But just to tell you, there are still people who have studied tremendously, but who still have those kind of colonial ideas. It is very hard to uproot them. And that is why we need to have such a space like African Studies Association, where we can come together and try to push for the agenda and try to protect also the interests of the African people. Okay, so we try also to promote and encourage Africa-centered education and informed understanding of Africa through museums, archives, schools, policymakers, NGOs, media, business, learned societies, and other interested communities. This is what I'm doing here. Okay, so where are my colleagues who have been doing research on Africa, and what kind of bridges we can establish to collaborate in research, to talk to one another and not work in silos, okay? How can I go to France or to Belgium and say, you know what, all the stuff that you hold in these museums, they have been generating income for you. You stole them during colonization, they belong to us. And when we talk about restitution, please don't understand that to simply be you giving them back. There are conditions and preconditions that you need to meet before we can do that, So there is a whole, group of African scholars working on these issues and this topic. So promote links with Africans and institutions in Africa and in the diaspora, and finally encourage partnership with existing associations of African studies and other organizations interested in African affairs, okay? So this is what we're doing, and this is my gratitude to you. So I already mentioned some of these ideas. In 1962, there was this wonderful major conference, like Congress, of all the intellectuals in Africa, but also in the diaspora. People who've been reading some of this, they know maybe W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of these major scholars who went to Ghana. He's one of the founding fathers, actually, of African studies in the US. He was African American. And when he went to Ghana in the early 60s, when Kwame Nkrumah was being sworn in as the first president, he returned for the conference in 62, and Nkrumah told him, why don't you take the project of writing an encyclopedia Africana? So an encyclopedia that will produce knowledge in all the areas about Africa, but which will be Africa-centered, not West like, epistemologies, but things that African scholars have researched on and they want to talk about in a way that corrects the mistakes of those, biases from colonial. Du Bois agreed. He moved to Africa. He was already very old, but he started working on that project. But mind you, the project existed before, and someone like, what time is it? Okay. Someone like Herkovitz, who was one of the biggest names in African studies in the US. There is actually one library at Northwestern University on African studies, one of the best in the world that bears his name. He had opposed developing knowledge on the African continent. But curiously, in Ghana, he was very much willing to participate, okay? I will try to move quickly. I mentioned the ICADs that we already spoke about, which was very much in line with the ICA, so the first Congress, and the ICAD was trying to resurrect what happened. So after 62 conference, there was a second one that Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, tried to host. 73, it moved to Addis Ababa. In 78, it moved to Kinshasa. In 85, it was in Nigeria, and then it went dormant. So 5 editions. In 2023, scholars said we need to resurrect this. And that is why we found ourselves doing it in Ghana, in Lubumbashi, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that was the committee of people who were, working on the Congress, ICAD. I can move on So this is our conference, in Lubumbashi. I mentioned that we went to visit the site where Lumumba was assassinated, and the tree against which he was assassinated has become like a museum. And for many people who have emotional connection, it was quite something very, touching and very moving. So my second part, which I will try also to just, I think I took too much time on the first part, would be now to look at the content analysis of what African scholars have been doing, okay? And as I promised, I just look at maybe 3 important, sources of knowledge, okay? The first one, which I call like the insurrection of ontologies, okay? It is coming from a very bright young scholar from Senegal, whose name is Cheikh Thiam. And I've been really privileged to work closely with Cheikh Thiam. His book, Epistemologies from the Global South, Negritude, Modernity, and the Idea of Africa, is engaging a whole range of scholarship that has been produced on Africa since the 30s, the 40s, the 50s to this day. And the main ontology that was used is the Negritude movement, okay? Negritude, I don't know how many of you may be familiar with that, but Léopold Sédar Senghor Aimé Césaire, Léon Gontradama were three, Africans from Africa and the diaspora who met in Paris in the 30s and who said, oh, we need to do something about our Africanness, African identity. Because every time that the colonial masters wanted to denigrate the Africans, they would call them Negro and dismiss them. So Negro became an insult, and Africans started feeling ashamed of being Africans. So the negritude movement started to ascertain that being African is wonderful, it's beautiful. Leopold Sédar Senghor, who was a great poet, wrote amazing poetry about African beauty and so on and so forth. But in connection also with the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s in New York and so on and so forth. Okay, so I am passing over this, but just to say that my friend Cher Thiam has done an amazing job of passing in review, like reviewing all the scholarship about negritude and the critiques. Because most of the critiques of negritude say, oh, this movement was actually a response of Leopold Sédar Senghor to the white people in Europe, the colonial masters. And Thiam is saying in his book, oh my God, please pause. You don't understand Senghor. I have gone back and did some research about Senghor as a person. He was really an African mystic. And everything Senghor is talking about, it is not to address the white people, as it is to bring the African people back to their roots. Okay? So from the ontological perspective, we need to come back to who we are, where we stand, where we are grounded, and dig to take out, to exhume actually those values from which Senghor was talking. Okay, so he makes a very cogent and powerful argument in his book, which is here, by the way. Okay, so just in summary, it's the relevance of this book for African studies, since negritude is generally acknowledged as one of the founding moments of the discipline of African studies. Reading it in a new way will necessarily have repercussion on the ways we think of post-negritude African scholarship. Okay, so he is reviving the whole scholarship about negritude. A few years ago, I think 10 years ago, there is another powerful scholar from Africa. He's now teaching at Harvard University, Celestin Monga. He's from Cameroon. He has written another book on negritude, which he calls Negritude et Nihilisme, like negritude and nihilism. And his approach to negritude is somehow different from the one that, Thiam is talking about. And that is why I'm saying really, it is also a matter of generations, okay? Because different generation may have a different look at different realities, depending on, their experience. Many Africans of my generation, actually, I would say grew up not being constrained by location, by geographies, but, the globalization has become a reality. So they're very much comfortable being in, Harvard or, Sorbonne or any other places, okay? So that changes the way you look at things. The other book I mentioned actually is Africa Beyond Inventions. Mudimbe is someone you need to know. Mudimbe has published tremendously, and his scholarship actually spans the 60s all the way to now. So he's one of those giants scholars who has produced knowledge about Africa, and he has a trilogy which begins with the invention of Africa, goes to the idea of Africa, and then in 2013 he published Africa Fault Lines, okay? Just to mention those. But he has written in literature, in poetry, in philosophy, so he is very hard to read and very hard to classify, okay? But what I was pleased with when these scholars reached out to me to ask me to write the preface of this book. So I had to read all the essays, and I just realized there is a kind of être décomplexé. I don't know how you say this in English. It's like, some people may help me. To be décomplexé, so they don't have any complex of inferiority or superiority. They just say what they have to say. okay? And now they're taking it to Mudimbe himself, who is the giant, and saying, maybe we need to go beyond these dichotomies, okay? And giving too much power to the West for having invented Africa. Mudimbe is the one who coined the term or the concept of colonial library. And it makes sense because knowledge is cumulative, okay? I said at some point that I'm very happy to be here talking to the Japanese colleagues because we don't have a colonial history together. And so I hope when I read the Japanese scholars, it will be somehow different. But look here, maybe my colleagues from Japan got to learn first about Africa through the colonial library, which may have also biased their own frameworks of understanding. Okay, so the forest structure or all the praxis, you know, the way the brain is shaped, okay, can be already tinted by some of these biases, cultural, economic, and so on and so forth. So these people are giving, you know, engaging the colonial library issue and just reminding people that we need to reinvent our own Africa, the Africa we live in, the Africa we experience, and so on and so forth. It's a great book, 2 weeks old on the market. You can find it. I hope there is a new version, but even on Amazon, I'm sure it should be accessible and available. Many, you know, philosophers, political scientists have made some contribution that I found very amazing. Finally, and I am rushing because I'm very mindful of the time, there is this journal. I mentioned the Global Africa Journal. We just published this as our 6th issue. We started in 2022. And I say this is really, really an ambitious journal. We meet oftentimes to discuss about the state or status of knowledge production on Africa or in Africa. And this scholar said it is time that we stop waning as Africans. Sometimes African scholars will produce a piece of, you know, an article and send it to some journals or some books abroad, and the article is refused, rejected, because it does not fit with the maybe editorial board of that review, okay? And so Africans feel, oh no, we wanted to publish in the West because it gives you some social or intellectual thickness. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to drive at, okay? So people in Africa who want to publish, they want their names to be known by the Western universe of academia. So that's a subtle way in which colonization is still playing in the mind, as if you need the West to get validated in your scholarship. So we said, no, we're not going to condone such a thing. We are going to create a space where many African scholars will feel proud to publish. And knowing that, you know, we're not competing really in the knowledge production market, you know, the output of Africa is very small. We say also, we cannot just reject a piece because it doesn't present itself well enough or ready enough, okay, for publication. We need to mentor and accompany these young scholars until their pieces is ready for publication in a scientific journal, okay? We wanted this journal to be indexed, you know, in the world of scientific reviews, which it is, okay? And so Global Africa, why am I talking about? It's because it's not simply a journal. It is a project, okay? Every summer, Global Africa hosts what we call École des Jeunes Chercheurs. So it's like a school for young researchers, okay? So we bring big shots like Felwin Sarr, like Achille Mbembe, like, you know, to just journey with the young academics in Africa so that they can be mentored for a few weeks and learn about writing academic papers, okay? So we do this every summer. This coming, it won't be in summer, it will be in October. We're taking people to Ghana, to Accra, okay, for this program, okay? So we do not do that only, we do conferencing, okay? And now we're developing actually a program, a master's program, online program as Global Africa, you know, on publishing, because we want also to revamp some of the university presses, you know, across the African continent. So just to say, there is so much that the younger generation of African scholars on the continent have been doing to compensate for that deficit of knowledge production, but also to break free from the constraints of the inheritance from traditional and colonial, you know, studies, okay? So I wanted to conclude so that we can have time to interact, okay? To do African studies on the African continent definitely has something different from doing African studies, let's say at Harvard. I am in contact with my colleagues at Harvard. I was at Harvard in September last year for a different course that I was taking there and interacted with the African studies community, okay? This is Harvard, one of the most powerful institutions in the world of knowledge production, but it has its own canon and rigidities, and we have to engage these people. So for us doing African studies on the African continent for African people, make us much more aware, if you will, of first of all, the content of things that we want to be discussing about, talking about, how we want to be conducting research, and how we want to be, you know, storing and disseminating the research outcome. So our young organization, ASAA Africa, compared to the old ASAA US, which was founded actually in 1957. And I don't know if you know, but already in 1958, 59, there were tensions. The African Americans in that organization felt we cannot belong. We do not belong anyway. Okay, in 1969, I believe actually the African Americans dumped the African, you know, association and said we have to create our own space. Okay, so it was the Association of African American Heritage, you know, so cultural. Just to say, you have also some history back behind this. Is a statement to the significant role that you know, the current generation of African scholars play in the evolution of African studies in Africa. They continue building on the work of first-generation scholars, but they adopt a different methodological posture to produce new knowledge about Africa. So the concept that I utilized to talk about epistemological insurrection that I have coined holds some significant weight. It simply signifies a substantial challenge to the authority established disciplines and the canonized text, thereby underlining African studies' exciting and dynamic evolution. This evolution is not just a change, but a sign of growth and progress in the field. By saying this, I'm not saying that we're doing something new. We're saying simply that we recognize there has been tension within the field of African studies. We acknowledge that, and we try to bring our own response to those tensions. And that is creating a new space where we can bring Japanese scholars, Indian scholars, American scholars, French scholars, and say, please keep quiet and listen to us. You have to listen to what we have to say, okay? So I will leave it there, basically. But you know, whatever I didn't touch, maybe I hope in the question it will come up, and I will be able to talk about it. So thank you so very much for your time, for your attention, and I will give the mic back to the moderator, any of the moderators. Thank you.
Okay. Please share Q&A session. I would like to the moderator of the Kitinji-san. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your wonderful speech. And thank you also very much for the audience for listening carefully. We're going now to the Q&A session. And for the people online, I'll give you a chance to prepare your questions also, but please allow me to start with the people in the audience that is present here. I understand we have two kinds of audience here. Some of us are students, which is perfect, and others are quite advanced in their research. So I think we'll be okay to take questions depending on how you understand the situation. First come, first served. And if you're ready, please let me see your hand. No one is ready? Oh, great.
Where to the microphone?
Hold on as the microphone comes to where you are. So let's pick the first two and then keep them very brief so that we can encourage more people to participate in the question and answer session. Thank you,
Sure.
Professor.
Thank you.
Please begin with your name and
Sure.
then your question.
Thank you very much to Professor Kafahire. My name is Wakiko. I teach here. And I have two questions. The first one is that the beautiful picture you showed us on the, maybe it's the top page of the Global Africa Journal. If you can show us that picture, the drawing again.
The journal is here. Sorry, here.
Yeah.
Good.
And I was just wondering who drew that picture. It's also the African person, I assume. Yeah, and if you know about the artist, just share the information with us. And the second question is about the epistemological insurrection. Whenever I talk to African philosophers or African scholars like you, I was always curious how you communicate that importance of the insurrection with the general public or the younger generation. But now I'm also wondering how much is this idea of epistemological insurrection shared with those people who claim to be the leaders of your country? So the top leaders, the national leaders, like the president of the DRC right now, how much is this importance of decolonization, the insurrection shared with the African
Terrific
top
questions.
leaders?
Thank you.
Thank you. That was my question.
If one more person, then he is going to answer the two questions together. So Chizuko-san.
Thank you so much. My name is Chizuko Sato. I am working at the Institute of Developing Study, Developing Economies. My question, I think it's just one. You put it, the formation of African Studies Association in Africa as a sort of reselection of Pan-Africanism of 1960s. So if I remember correctly, that Pan-Africanism of 1960s, I think as you said, like these Du Bois, who are based outside Africa, played an important role in putting forward that Pan-Africanism. So I want to know whether, I just want to know a bit more about the background of this formation of ASAA, and then the relationship between African scholars based in African academic institutions on the continent and then African scholars outside Africa. Whether any significant roles has been played by this diaspora Africans, and what are actually the real relationship between diaspora scholars and then African scholars based in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you for the two questions. We received the answers. Then we'll begin in the next session. We'll begin with a question from the people online.
Okay, so thank you very much for those wonderful questions. About the artists, we have people who work on the design. They're based in Dakar for sure. And I think we pay actually people who do all the design, graphic, and everything else. So I can find more information about the person. I don't have the hard copy, but usually also behind we have the name of the picture of the artist and so on and so forth. So that will be resolved. It's a technical question. The more difficult question that you asked me. Yeah, the languages that we use in academia sometimes tend to be in disconnect with the average people, you know, So how do we communicate with the average people about some of these, ruptures and knowledges and so on and so forth? But also, how do we communicate even with our leaders, okay? Maybe I should lump the two questions together because I was asked about, the leadership, or let's say the background to the early, conference that took place in Accra. I think there is some connection, and I will try to establish this, okay? Those who became leaders in the early days of Africa's independence, thanks God, they were brilliant minds and very well educated. And those who did not have like a formal high degree from universities, they were self-trained. They were autodidact. Okay, someone like Lumumba read a lot. Mobutu, who was the first, second president of the Congo, he might not have gone to study at the university level, but he was one of the most well-educated person in terms of, understanding scholarship. Okay, so Nkrumah in Ghana was a doctor. Okay, Nyerere in Tanzania, we call him Mwalimu, the teacher, right? So these people were really elites because they were well educated. I am not saying anything about the leadership that we have today, but it looks to me that things have changed a little bit. There is a subtle change, okay, in the kind of leadership that we have today in the neoliberal globalized world, because everything is geared or oriented toward business. Who can make money is the person who can lead. It doesn't go like that, but unfortunately, it is business-oriented people, not mind or knowledge production-oriented people, people who want to understand, who are running Africa. Some of the key, intellectuals who have been president, you can name someone like Thabo Mbeki in South Africa. Everyone will tell you, Thabo Mbeki would not make a policy lightly. He would want to study, to understand the intricacies of the issue before he could lead, to making a decision. Many of our current leaders, unfortunately, today seem not to be understanding that. And so there is that disconnect between academia and the policy making. And I am saying this in my paper, okay, that we may need to bridge, the knowledge production on the African continent and the leadership in politics, because not our issues and our knowledge production is guiding our leaders, but the donors in the West, okay, and those who kind of provide, legitimacy to their leadership or to their authority. So that's something we are very much aware of. And this is why ASAA, we're working really hard to establish a link between our association with the African Union. We're trying to meet with head of states prior to, Macky Sall leaving power. We're trying to enter dialogue. Next year, we're taking ASAA to Cabo Verde. And currently, I am in a dialogue with my colleagues in Cabo Verde because the ASAA leadership wants to meet with the head of state of Cabo Verde to advance, to lobby about one of the key scholars, activists, of the 70s, Amilcar Cabral, whose house has been abandoned somehow. And ASAA believes this could become maybe a center of research or a cultural center, but we need to dialogue with the government. So our colleagues are trying to establish, so we're trying at least to bridge, the knowledge we are producing with the leadership on the continent. With the local people, it's still somehow difficult, but the moment we produce books, we hope that once we have enough, like we reach the threshold that is necessary, maybe this can begin to seep also into the way we package, things we teach from elementary school to high school and so on and so forth, because this knowledge has not changed from the colonial times. But it's a big challenge or challenging question. Thank you. Sure.
For the good question, let's now go to the question from Augustine Bahemuka. Please unmute yourself and let's hear your question. And then we'll pick one more question from the floor. Augustine, if you're ready.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Clear and loud.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Tusa. Happy to hear from you. I must first of all say I'm very honored to have been a student of Dr. Tusa. It was very interesting. 2 years. He taught me African studies, international relations, for my master's in peace studies in Nairobi. And two things I want to say. One is I'm happy that Dr. Tusa is still preaching the African gospel like he did preach to us as students. He challenged us to begin thinking African-wise. I think that is one of the things that I remember very well from him. And I remember we used to struggle as a class to find examples in the African context because, like he has told us, the examples before us, much of the knowledge and the books that are there for us to read, even about Africa, were from the West. So we struggled to see, to find African examples in the African context, from the African experience. So I want to thank you very much, Dr. Tusa. I want to share two experiences. One is we may remember that we have an ecological crisis, and in 2015, Pope Francis published a very, very comprehensive thesis on ecology and environment, Laudato Si. And in that spirit, in Uganda, we have we initiated about 1.5 years ago an initiative called the Laudato Si Youth Initiative. It's a network of school clubs where we preach the gospel of looking after the environment, planting trees and looking after them. We want to also enroll other activities, cleaning the environment. We want to have also, we have in plan sessions like this one to preach the gospel. But what is so different about Laudato Si Youth Initiative is that we are young people, and these are school-going students, but preaching the gospel of caring for the environment, our shared home, our primordial home, from an African experience. This is what puts us different from other Laudato Si inspired institutions, associations, if you may, like the Laudato Si movement, which is international. The difference is that ours is in an African experience, small actions that we can move around young people so that we can inspire the rest of the world. We are acting locally, but thinking globally. Now, my question to Dr. Tusa is, I remember one of the people that we have read that I'm impressed myself very well. Yes, you can hear me? Yeah, I'm finishing up. It's called Wangari Maathai. And Wangari Maathai from Nairobi, Kenya, she was a great environmentalist and an activist in Kenya. One of the issues she raised was that the loss of our historical wisdom or heritage is probably one of the causes of the problems we have in Africa. The loss of our heritage. In other words, after colonialism, the period that followed, we were so fast in adopting the colonists' minds. And then somehow we lost our African heritage. Those with that wisdom in which our forefathers used to solve the problems that they had. So, Dr. Tusa, my question to you would be, what do you think are some of those things that we can do, especially for us, the young scholars now, to help us appreciate or to help us retrieve some of that wisdom, in the African wisdom of that time? That would be my question to you. Especially in light of the experience you just shared, where the leaders that took over the immediate period after after independence seem to be well educated and well intended, vis-a-vis those we have today who are more political and also economic minded. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for your question. I think any quick one, then make it very short from that experience. Very short. Yeah, please, Katsumata-san.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Etienne.
Yeah.
I had to, may I call you Professor, mon père. So I have one just small question. You have mentioned to the new book written by Sheikh Cham. It might be former colleague by University Dakar when I was a long time ago. You know, for this big new book, I have not read this new book. Epistemology from Global South. Negritude, modernity, and the idea of Africa. But I'm a little bit skeptical how we could essentialize Africa itself, you know. I remember when Frantz Fanon, who fascinated the struggle of Black Panthers, Black radicals in New York, you know. I think they refer often to Frantz Fanon's works, you know, like white skin and black, black skin and white mask, you know.
The other way around.
And Fanon was used to say that I'm not proud to be descendant of a slave, you know. I don't know. I could understood correctly. So what do you think about, you know, essentialization of African spirit?
Thank you. Let's now receive the answers. I would like to give a chance to young students to ask a question. So please make it also very short when you answer the question.
Very good. Thank you so very much. Okay. So thank you, Augustine. Augustine was a student of mine when I taught in Nairobi, and I'm very glad to meet him again online after so many, many years. Thank you for the question. Nairobi is a place where I have my heart buried. We watched and followed what was going on in Kenya recently. There is this Gen Z, right? Generation Z that has just been very active in the political sphere to say we care about our future. And this can happen only with people who are highly educated about their rights and everything else. So it is good to reconnect with someone who is in the region, although Augustine might be in Uganda at this point. So Augustine is asking me the question about what can we do, I mean, to tap into the resources that we do have in Africa and reuse actually the African wisdom to solve some of these issues. I will tell Augustine simply, I remember actually when I finished my PhD, I did it in Chicago, moved back to Kenya to start working and teaching. After 1 year of teaching, I received evaluations from my students. And my students, one of the key evaluations that they made, actually, you know, observational remarks, they said, oh my God, your knowledge is West-centric. You didn't use any African writer or author and so on and so forth. So that was before I became an Africanist myself, okay? But just to say, Africa has a lot of resources, and where there is no resources, that was I'm saying about the global Africa, we have to create them. We have to write them ourselves. The wisdom of Africa is very much available. Oftentimes in Africa, we say when an elder person dies, it's the library that burns down, okay? The fight we're doing with restitution of African artifacts, you know, material, immaterial, you know, cultural heritage, is to remind Europeans that, you know what, we may not have written books, but all of the wisdom that we have was confined into these, which you put in museums, but which speak to us in a completely different way. I was in Accra in August 2023, on the restitution front. And as I took the floor and presented my paper, someone was like, oh my God, you are a Jesuit priest. How can you reconcile your claim to these artifacts and your Jesuitness? I said, I'm a Jesuit priest and a scholar, but I am primarily an African. And what I am doing as an African is really to reclaim what is ours, what allows us to stand, strong and firm and upright in our own identities. So just to remind Bahemuka that the work needs not to be done by others. The work has to be done by you, Augustine, and all the Generation Z or others who are, out there trying to address some of the issues that we face. They told me to keep it short, so I will get to the next question about Frantz Fanon. And I'm very happy actually because this whole debate about essentializing, our African identities, the blackness and everything else, are things that Sheikh Thiam is talking about in the book. And it is a debate that has always been there when we talk about negritude, okay? Many of the critiques of negritude, and many people actually who have criticized negritude to say this is just a reverse racism. Because you're taking maybe the universal categories of the Western epistemologies, and you are applying it to the Black people. And you are making a thing as if there was anything like a Black essence, right? I mentioned also Celestin Monga. Celestin Monga has one example that he uses in his book, Negritude and Nihilism. And he's saying, look here, I am running into New York. You have all these people who are selling stuff like Nyak Nyak or whatever, Senegalese people, or whether it is in Paris or any other place. You find some Senegalese people, some African people selling small stuff. When the police come, they pack everything and they run away, right? So Monga is saying these are African people. Tell me, what do these African people have anything to do, let's say, with Obama or Oprah? Is it simply because of the skin color? They have nothing to do in common whatsoever. So he's saying we cannot essentialize, okay? And I don't think Thiam is essentializing, nor Senghor was, because that's the argument that Thiam is driving at, right? Is to remind people that when Senghor goes back to his Serer, culture and background, to talk to all the mystics from his own traditions and to learn from them, he's rather doing that because he believes that there is a cultural identity that shapes us into who we are, and it is not simply because of the skin color that we can share equally across the continent. Okay, Fanon's critic, okay, Fanon was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, right, who saw the ravages of colonization because he received so many patients, okay, who came to his cabinet, whom he treated, whether in Black Africa or White Africa, okay, Algeria, okay, because he worked a lot in Algeria. But what Fanon is doing also is to show that the ravages actually of structures and institutions, not the essence of the people. Because if we can make any claim to say a Japanese has desires, I have the same desires, then we are leaving the area of essentialism because we are recognizing that we share the same essence, which is rather humane. So Thiam is saying Senghor is simply trying to humanize people whose humanity has been denied. And that is the essence of negritude. Okay, so thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much again for making it also very quick. This is the last question we're going to be taking. We have 3 minutes, then we finish our meeting. Okay, we have one. Anyone else? So begin from her, then we.
There are three.
Professor.
I think there was another one here.
Thank you so much for your talk today, Professor. My question is, would it be possible for not just African and Japanese scholars to connect and exchange knowledge, but also particularly Africans and others from the Asian global south? What do we have to offer one another, and what kind of challenges do you think would come with that cooperation?
Mhm.
Thank you. Let's take it from the other side, and then we'll give the professor to answer the questions.
Thank you, Professor. I think the colonial epistemology is also persisting in the African countries. As I'm working in the Cameroon, I'm an anthropologist working with the minorities who is living in the tropical rainforest. For example, the elites there, often they use narratives very, I feel it is very colonial against such minorities. Not only such as the world of the bureaucratism, in the educational sector, I think such as the colonial epistemology is reproduced under the higher education, for example, in the university. So today I came to know your academic movement, including the creation of the new academic platform. I think it is a very important thing. But on the other hand, I wondered how such the new movements can change the reality of education system in African universities. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. You can take on.
Can I beg for Jesus, who wanted also to have a quick question?
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Quickly, please.
Well, it's kind of related to another question. And there is the movement that is being described in Africa to research their own knowledge and create their own epistemologies. It's a movement that is also happening in Latin America since the 70s, for example, with the philosophy of liberation or transmodernism that comes from Latin America philosophers. So there is also like this kind of movement for epistemological liberation. So is there some allyship between Africa and Latin America to engage in this process of decolonization?
Good. Thank you. So tremendous
so much.
question, beautiful questions. When I heard Maxine asking the question, actually, I was reminded of a very dear friend whom I had a conversation with about the global South, okay? And he was reminding me that next year, actually, there was a conference called Bandung Conference in 1955. So next year it's gonna be 70 years. And scholars want to be celebrating and marking that, okay? So those moments are moments that bring scholars in the global South together because we have a long history together. We have a long journey together, okay? And there are so many African studies, in fact, not only Japan, but South Korea, India, and so on and so forth. And I'm being educated and broadening my scope and perspective about this also as I interact with most of my colleagues here. So it is very much possible and it is happening. Coming back to what you just said, it is true, okay? The 70s, actually, Latin America was like the flag bearer of what I, as a priest, call theology of liberation, okay? We do have different approaches to theology of liberation or liberation movements because Latin America used very much the Marxist framework and focused a lot on the material liberation, economics, and so on and so forth. In Africa, what we have lived through the colonization was the depletion of the personality or the personhood of Africans through, stripping us of our own cultures, traditional values, and everything else. And for us, liberation actually was how do we regain back, our personhood, personalities, and so on and so forth. So we've been fighting the same battles, but maybe on different fields, cultural or material and economic, okay? It doesn't mean Africa is not being like, stripped of all its resources. We know the multinationals that are there for minerals and so on and so forth. So we are in the same war, but I believe actually the power of the now, the power of current structures within which we live, is that it has succeeded in atomizing, like breaking those kind of bonds and capacity to come together and become a force, to fight against the common enemy. That is what our predecessors had. And I failed to talk much about the Pan-African movement, okay, Pan-Africanism. The whole of last year, the African Studies Association received some funding from the Open Society, and we organized several conferences on Pan-Africanism. Tanzania, Senegal, Congo, Martinique, okay, because we're talking about the diaspora, and at some point someone asked about the diaspora. And even when we were in Lubumbashi, actually, we had people who came from the Caribbeans, okay, the Black diaspora, who are trying to see how we can reconnect the mother continent with their own communities and say we need to work in synergy so that we can address some of these big issues that we cannot move when you are just one single person. So this is very much something we have in our consciousness, and which we're trying to build into our own movement. Finally, the question about academia, right? I think I wrote down. So universities and narratives, elites, that's so very true. I don't think we can avoid that because the like the format within which we've been trained is very much Western. When the West left, those of us elite who stepped into those positions just behaved West. And this is what we're calling the decolonization. There is a huge movement. Someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, again from Kenya, has been talking about decolonizing the mind. So every time we have fora, like spaces like this, university, we tend to invite our leaders. So one innovation, one thing that we did well in Lubumbashi when we met as ASA, okay, and why we received even the funding that we received from the Open Society to host this is because we didn't want academics to be talking to themselves. So not only academics, we invited the civil society, artists, leaders, policymakers, so that we can be cross-fertilizing, different domains in which we make all these decisions that impact our lives. And so we're very much aware of the issue you raised, that Africans now can be the colonists, to their own people. But what do we do, to move out of that space? It's something that we just need to be aware of and begin to. And I mentioned also very briefly that it is really unfortunate that socializing, most of our leaders, okay, find it easy to go West, like, socialize with the West, so there is a kind of rupture between leaders and their communities. And this is why I keep telling my students that sometimes when a leader is very famous in the West, he's applauded as a good leader in Africa. When you go back home, you will find that that leader is disavowed by his own people and his own community. So the standards are not the same. And it's up to us maybe to see how we can bridge that knowledge with the social realities and begin to transform our communities. So thank you so very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Please help me to appreciate Professor for a great speech. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You may have noticed that when he was talking about Kenya, he was pointing at me. It's because I come from Kenya. And I want to appreciate some people here. This event was organized by the Institute of Asian, African, and Middle Eastern Studies of Sophia University. And it was also supported by Japan Society for Afrasian Studies and the African Study Centers of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. We happen to actually have the two presidents of those two organizations right here with us. So I would like to recognize the presence of the president of JSAS, Professor Hanai. Thank you so much for coming. And I would also like to appreciate the Director of African Studies Centers of TAFS, and who is also the President of Japan Association for African Studies, Professor Takeuchi. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to ask a question, but there is no time, so we have to go. But my question was about, you told us about how and what about African studies, and I wanted to ask you, who should study Africa? We should do African studies, maybe from a selfish point of view, where sometimes as an African coming to Japan, I wonder whether I should be doing Japanese studies or I should be doing African studies. But maybe that's a topic for another time. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We do hope to have you in our future events. We'll be sending the questionnaires to you. Please respond to the questionnaire. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Please give us your feedback through the questionnaire and the Zoom participant that will appear immediately after the Zoom close. Also, attendants will receive the questionnaire from via email, but you can also complete the questionnaire using the on-screen QR code, please. Also, I hope, Tusan-sensei, I hope you will introduce next year ASA International Conference.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, thank you so very much. In fact, I can't forget to do that. I said that we have conferences every 2 years. So 2023, we were in Congo. 2021, we're supposed to be in Cape Town in South Africa. But because of COVID and traveling was still very difficult, we postponed by 6 months. And in April 2022, we're in Cape Town in South Africa. So next year, 2025, we're going to be in Cabo Verde, in Praia. Beautiful city, beautiful country. It's an island next to Senegal. And ASA is really open to everyone, okay? We simply want to encourage you to come, okay? I was in a meeting with the vice rector of University of Cabo Verde a couple of days ago, maybe 5 days, maybe. Because we're trying to put out, the call for paper, but everything else has been decided on. And it's just a beautiful moment, good vibe, good energy when scholars, with similar interests can come and share part of their research. Student as well. I don't know about Sophia politics, but many students from other universities in developed countries, they apply for funding and they can go and attend some of these conferences. And if they have a paper that they can put together, this is how you begin to become a scholar, okay? It might not be perfect, but you can work with one of your professors and continue to develop it until it becomes something presentable, okay? So I want to encourage the students, depending on, the authorities who are here, and wherever we shall be, we can also help, okay? If you have a topic, a subject that you feel is dear to your heart and you want us to accompany you, we shall be there to work with you, okay? So come travel. It is always very fun and very beautiful to be meeting in different places and, create knowledge. I didn't even talk about the journal, which we call Bokutani, the Journal of African Studies Association of Africa, which we launched at our last conference in Lubumbashi. Bokutani is a Lingala concept, which means encounter, encuentro, rencontre, okay? I don't know how you say this in Japanese, but I can learn, okay? But simply to say that every time we come together, we really need these ideas coming from everyone to continue building the kind of society and futures that we all dream together. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the attendance. Now we will close the Zoom.